What's up, everyone? Welcome to the 26th episode of Super Brain Radio, the first episode of Chapter 6, Useful Tools. And this one is going to be especially exciting because we're going to be taking a small sidestep laterally from developing content, and we're going to start talking about things that I actually find useful in daily procedural attempts to increase your performance on whatever that performance is. Performance is a really broad noun that we're using now. When we start to talk about things like specific performance, we're going to use adjectives to describe that noun. However, performance is just your ability to maximally participate in X. And as we start talking about it, I just want to introduce to you guys 4 of my favorite modes of being able to do that in a fashion that capitalizes on information we've already covered. So I think it's going to be fun. I also think it's important to be able to control the information you have. And what I mean by that is you know something in your head, you diagnose it potentially in a client or yourself, but you just don't know how to solve the equation, or the ability and attempts needed to solve the equation are greater than what you currently possess. So you solve that by feeling a synergistic change, not just in yourself, but in how things are done related to solving a problem ultimately. Now, the first thing we need to all remind ourselves of is the brain is different than the skin suit. What's happening north of the neck is different than what's happening south of the neck. I've mentioned this many times, but for this episode specifically, as we talk about choline and electricity, we're kind of being specific about the analogy of fuel to a vehicle or a machine. Now, it's not that the typical glucose amino acids and fatty acids don't apply north of the neck, but more importantly, they don't quite fit that analogy. That analogy can be much more specifically described by choline and electrical input. Now, to start talking about it, we need to just kind of familiarize ourselves with how a neuron turns on. The typical terms here are fire, excitation, something like that, but it's just essentially a light switch with varying degrees of how much light it can produce based on maybe how hard you flick the switch or whatever dial you turn it to, something like that, right? But there's varying degrees of being, turned on, if you will. So when we talk about electrical input, it's coming from either ourselves intervening with the world, or the world intervening with us. I've mentioned this biphasic highway of communication a couple times, but what we're really talking about here is, are you feeling safe enough to recruit your absolute best and turn on a specific part of your brain and get it as red hot as possible, as we've mentioned with LTP in the past? Or is it the exact polar opposite? Do you feel so unsafe and vigilant that your brain is recruiting all ability electrically possible to deal with the world around you? Obviously, both are necessary. Hopefully, you're in control enough to recruit the former, meaning you feel safe enough to do everything you absolutely need to. And that's what we're talking about. So, as you climb that ladder of success and excellence, you're going to have a history book that is increasing in density of how much electrical input has been sent, how chronically, and what ultimately included in this, in the notes if you will, would be what the outcome was and how comfortable you are there. As you get increasing rates of success and eliteness in whatever you're participating in, you have to start to account for how much excitation is going to be needed to continue to progress. And that is going to be raw electrical input. How inundated in your ability to do what you're doing is at your hands. The pan you cook with gets as hot as the stove's input. So what we're talking about here is just kind of blind electricity, right? It's more of a vehicle, a carrier for some type of information that's being picked up at one of the neuron's hubs, one of the start-stop cortices in the brain. Maybe it's a muscle. It's all going through the spinal cord at some point, but whatever it is, the end hub and the beginning hub both have information that are waiting to be paired ideally with this electricity, and hopefully that you get the right coordinated outcome. But we can't just do that. We obviously need some type of translator, if you will. And choline is that ideal mediator for information paired with electricity and the ability to break it down at the end hub and actually use it for something. Choline has a capacity, it recycles, but most importantly to remember and to think about it as is it has a cost. Acetylcholine is going to be this translator for getting your muscles turned on and being able to contract and do stuff. It's going to have a negative waste product, as most things do, and that's acetate. Acetate needs to be handled because it decreases electrical sensitivity. It even decreases sensitivity to glucose and amino acids acutely. So you need to be cholinergically trained in general and specifically in the task you're participating in to deal with it. If it's a sales call that you normally close in 12 minutes, now you're on minute 28, there isn't enough exposure unless you've trained yourself to be or supplemented for it to ensure that's possible, and there will be a decrease in performance just like there will be in sport if you choose to participate longer than you've trained yourself to be participating in. And that trained concept is of course mirrored south of the neck in the skin suit. You can only deal with enough cardiac and local hypoxia or lack of oxygen, lack of shuttling hormones and amino acids as needed and all that stuff. So the car is also not just dependent on the fuel, but dependent on the car's ability to handle the terrain. So all of this put together is going to be how you actually get through anything. We're not talking about starting the task right or anything prior like we will mindfully. Maybe when we talk about nootropics in the next episode, we'll go more in depth about the difference between the north and the south of the neck concepts and how they're actually totally different rules. But most importantly, we're talking about your ability to keep sending that signal properly and to ensure that you are actually prepared to get better at something. So, raw electrical input is an awesome product of mindfulness and being super clear about what you want to do. So it's not just being able to meditate and shut off. Now we're asking you to visualize, ideally in third person and first person, the behavioral manifestations, that ominous vibe, the actual participation of the skill. Can you do it in slow motion the same way? Can you do it in faster motion? Can you do it repeatedly? Can you see it from different perspectives on the field or on the side of the desk or on the side of the computer chair, whatever it is for you? How many different angles in the same room can you close your eyes and see yourself participating properly, mindfully from? All of these things come into play. We also need to remind ourselves of the concept that excellence and recruiting your best does have an increased cost. Highway mileage is different if you're driving 90. You don't get the same mileage as if you're driving the speed limit on the highway. Obviously, that expenditure is going to rest on the shoulders of choline. Choline, not just saying that it needs to come from nutrition, it needs to come from supplements, it needs to be able to be recycled and used. That acetate concept is not going to be handled by supplementation alone. So you could even argue that chronic supplementation of choline being paired with specific breakdowns and recycling of acetate is actually where you're getting the adaptive response from. It's not just putting choline into play. And finally, this is where things like anatomical angles, leverages, sport-specific performance come into play as well. You can't drive the car on terrain that the car is not meant to be driven on. So if you take a normal suspension on a mountain, even if you're driving like something that's meant to be doing that supposedly, that normal suspension is not going to be able to handle it for very long, as opposed to a suspension that has metal and specific elastic rebounding properties to handle those Newtonian forces. So it's not just the choline training and that cholinergic capacity or the ability to get an electrical input. It's really now becoming a conversation of managing waste and ensuring that you have enough electrical safety in your history book and choline in your pockets, if you will, to be able to actually do what you need to do.